raises or well changes the probability of B, and A precedes B in time. And of course, in philosophy, it is very common to discuss the barometer thought experiment, where we know that the indicator of barometer Granger causes or causes probabilistically storms, but you cannot intervene on the indicator to influence the weather. The conclusion from this case study is that you cannot so that you cannot intervene. So probabilistic causal claim does not imply that you can translate this claim to the manipulationist notion, so that you cannot say that by changing A you will influence B. And well, the reason is, of course, the so-called common cause fallacy. In the case of econometrics, econometric models do control for some confounding variables, but it is never possible to control for all possible confounders. And it is at least possible that some confounders may be not measurable, and therefore they cannot be controlled for econometrically. And the problem is that causal claims for example, four-dimensional model, probabilistic causal claims could be translated into the manipulationist notion if the world had indeed just 4 dimensions, or could be described with 4 variables. But in fact, the actual world have more dimensions, in the sense that there are more variables that should be implemented into the model, but they cannot be for obvious reasons. And therefore, one cannot translate, as in the case of barometer, the probabilistic causal claim into the manipulationist notion. However, I believe that the real problem with the barometer case, or with causal claims based on econometric models, or also observational studies in epidemiology or in biomedical sciences, is that we do not know what is the real causal structure. And that is, we don't know if the model is true, or the model is obviously false. So we cannot know that the model is obviously false, as in the case of barometer. Well, I can remember that in one of the many papers that discuss this thought experiment of barometer, the author said that you obviously know that you cannot intervene on the indicator to change weather. And in my view, when it comes to causal inference on the edge of science and on the edge of what we know, the real problem is that we do not know if we can intervene on barometer or not. And therefore, I believe that we should use our knowledge in the best way we can. So if we have, for example, an econometric model based on observational data that suggests that X causes Y, we cannot intervene on X to influence Y, but well, we can assume that this causal structure is stable, because econometricians are quite able at controlling for the changes in the structure, causal structure. They can test for the stability of parameters. So if the parameters are stable, we can inductively assume that they will be stable in the future. And we do indeed can intervene in a way that does not change the causal structure. So we cannot intervene on X to influence Y. But well, in the case of the barometer, we can take umbrella if and the indicator readings, the barometer readings are low. And in this way, we will not influence the causal structure. So we will not change the weather, but we will not get wet. So this intervention will be successful. And in the case of social sciences, I think that the best example of intervening or undertaking decisions based on probabilistic or regularity causal claims is insurance, is the activity of insurance companies that sell insurance for cars, for example, and they they set prices of insurance for red cars a bit higher because there's probably either some unknown common cause or a correlation between the color of car and the probability of an accident. So in this way, even though it is supposedly a false causal claim that red colors raise the probability of accidents, people can still use this probabilistic causal claims because well, they're true probabilistic causal claims, but false manipulationist causal claims. Because you know, I suppose that you cannot repaint a sport car to avoid crashes, and in this way, some types of decisions based on this type of evidence can be successful. I label such decisions actions, and they are decisions that do not involve modifying the relator of causal claim, so you cannot intervene on X to influence Y, but you can intervene or undertake action beyond this causal claim. You can use this knowledge to intervene on some other variable Z. Well, so economists also put forward mechanistic causal claims based on theoretical models. For example, here's a picture of DSGE modeling, which is quite popular for policy making, macroeconomic policy making. And actually, most economic models, theoretical economic models, can be shown to be similar to the definition of mechanism as interacting entities that produce and generate causal relations that supervene this mechanism. And well, I think that there are two problems with well, so in general, it is known that the knowledge of mechanism cannot be used as an evidence for a manipulationist causal claim. So you cannot intervene and suspect that this intervention will be efficient. And there are two problems. The first problem is that economists usually put forward mechanisms of possible models of possible mechanisms. And the other problem is the influence of other mechanisms. So even if you have a model of actual mechanism, then it is possible that there will be some other mechanism that will counteract the mechanism represented by the model to operate. And therefore, if you intervene on one particular mechanism without the knowledge of all other mechanisms, this intervention will not be, or is likely not to be successful. The situation can be compared to this undergrad. Well, so there's a model of Robinson-Crusoe discussed on undergrad courses, macroeconomic courses. And if that would be true, that there is just a desert island and there's one mechanism that describes the market, then you could translate a mechanistic causal claim into a manipulationist causal claim. But since it is not true, since in the world there are many mechanisms, that can be represented by different models, but economists would also have to understand how these mechanisms interact with each other. Therefore, you cannot translate a mechanistic causal claim into manipulationist causal claim. But mechanistic evidence can be useful for introducing institutional reforms, or so either designing mechanisms or stopping one mechanism from operating. But institutional reforms do not warrant that the effects of a causal claim will follow deterministically, because the operation of a mechanism can be influenced by other mechanisms. And finally, we have manipulationist causal claims. I must say that I'm a bit optimistic about using interventional evidence or evidence from interventional studies for policy making. Of course, there's the problem of extrapolation, which I suppose can be solved considering the example of biomedical sciences, where it is known that you cannot, for example, extrapolate the efficacy of vitamin C for curing common colds from rats to humans, at least as long as you do not have additional background knowledge. But I suppose that everyone will agree that we have an RCT suggesting that vitamin C is efficient in a group of economists. Then you can prescribe vitamin C to philosophers and it will be efficient. So I believe that social sciences could learn that you should test causal claims on a sample of the same population. The sample of the target where you want to intervene, and not, for example, extrapolate the evidence from experimental studies conducted in other countries. And I believe that if these experimental or quasi-experimental studies are properly conducted, they do warrant that you can intervene in the strict sense, so you can change X to influence Y. And also, I think that this movement of evidence-based medicine or evidence-based policy is primarily concerned with these interventions in the strict sense, and the reason is that this so-called pyramid or hierarchy of evidence uses the notion of confounding to put different types of evidence in order. So RCTs are least likely to be confounded, and observational studies of different types in medicine, like case control studies, for example, can be more likely to be confounded. But I believe that, and I hope that I convinced you that at least some types of interventions can be conducted based on evidence of maybe, or at least possibly, a false causal structure. So therefore, you can argue that EBM is focused primarily on these interventions in the strict sense. And I believe that either economic policy making or clinical decisions in the case of medicine are not that narrow. For example, you can think of, well, there's evidence that the children of older fathers are more likely to suffer from autism spectrum disorder. And because it is based on an epidemiological study, so basically on a statistical analysis of observational data, you can never exclude the possibility that there is a confounding factor. However, you can use such possibly fallacious evidence to undertake actions. So, for example, you can screen children of older fathers more often. And well, just as a conclusion, I suppose that EBM plus movement does not discuss interventions or different types of interventions explicitly. And I think that it could benefit from such a discussion. And well, I try to argue that economists are causal pluralists in the sense that they accept different definitions of causality to distinguish between causal and not causal relations. And you cannot translate probabilistic or regularity and mechanistic causal claims into the manipulationist notion of causality. So you cannot intervene in the strict sense based on these types of evidence. However, I showed that there are different types of economic or policy-making decisions. And therefore, different types of evidence can warrant or can justify different types of interventions. Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariusz.